And now, streaming live from the Newman Library Athenaeum on the Blacksburg campus of Virginia Tech, it's Vox Humanities Conversations with your host, the director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, Dr. Sylvester Johnson.
I'm Sylvester Johnson, and this is Vox Humanities Conversations, a live streaming program from the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. As with all productions under the Vox Humanities media imprint, the Conversations initiative places its focus on advancing human-centered knowledge. We do this by engaging with experts and scholars whose work explores human life and human culture through a critical lens, and that serves to enhance public understanding around the impact of social disparity in a complex world. What makes Conversations unique is an emphasis on sharing stories that connect us to the humanity within the humanities. For each episode, we invite one or more guests to open a window onto the story of their scholarship, both the story that stands behind their work and the story that lives within. The development of the microscope in the 1600s revolutionized the field of scientific knowledge by allowing scientists to observe and understand the microscopic world. The microscope enabled observation of living organisms and study of their structures and function in detail, and this led to breakthrough discoveries in fields such as biology and medicine and microbiology. This ability to see things at such a small level that was cellular and molecular opened up new avenues for research, and it enabled scientists to develop new theories and new models about how our world works. Today, the microscope continues to play a crucial role in scientific research, and its importance in changing our understanding of the world cannot be overstated. Our guest today, Dr. Bryan Klausmeyer, is an expert on the early development of the microscope and its importance in changing how we view the world and how we have advanced knowledge. Welcome, Professor Klausmeyer. So glad you could join us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's start with telling us what you do here at Virginia Tech.
Sure. I'm an assistant professor of German in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, and I teach courses regularly on topics related to German culture, usually from 18th century to the present, and I also teach upper-level German language.
That's great. So let's talk more about the research that you're doing. So you focus your research on one of the early modern scientists in particular. So who was this person, and why have they been so impactful on knowledge?
Yeah, sure. So the person in question would be Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who was born, I believe, in 1742 and died in 1799. So he lived basically through a fairly tumultuous period in European history, the period that's usually called the Age of Enlightenment. Could also call it the Late Enlightenment, depending on how you wanted to classify it. He was born in Hessen-Darmstadt, which is back then Western Central Holy Roman Empire. And it's probably worth mentioning as well that he was the first professor of experimental physics at the University of Göttingen, which was founded in, I believe, 1732. Back then, it was in the electorate of Hanover, which was in a personal union with Great Britain. And so the monarch of Great Britain at the time, George II, I believe, asked the monarch in Hanover to found a university on enlightened principles. And so by the time Lichtenberg joined the faculty, the university had been around for a couple of decades, and it became one of the sort of central organs of the Enlightenment in Germany prior to the French Revolution.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so you're pointing to so many things that's just making me think about the significance of what has been termed the Enlightenment and the kinds of scientific discoveries that proceeded from a number of different intellectual centers. Germany, of course, what we now today know as Germany, played such a critical role in that. And so can you mentioned the situation of this region in the Holy Roman Empire. So there were very important, it might be called orthodoxies, but structures of authority about knowledge of the world at that time. And here is someone who's participating in what was a growing set of practices and using this optical instrument to see things that not only had people not seen before, but had not really couldn't think about, and they're explaining things that are happening in the world based on what they're seeing in these instruments that most people didn't have access to today, or excuse me, didn't have access to at that time. So what were one or two things that Lichtenberg was able to advance and to disseminate public understanding about, and what was some of the reception to that?
Yeah, those are great questions. So maybe it helps to contextualize historically a little bit the situation of the microscope during this period.
Please.
Because the sort of boom, the explosion of interest in the microscope, it would really be more of a century and a half earlier. Robert Hooke's Micrographia appears in 1665, and that really kicks off the fad, the obsession with the microscope as a new scientific tool for discovery. It had been around before that, but Hooke's innovation was to increase the power, the capacity of the lenses on the microscope, and to actually use it for scientific purpose then. So that enhancement then enabled him to drill deeper into the organic structures of objects and to then perceive things that had prior to then never been perceived with the naked human eye. And as the Micrographia was, just as I think exciting for everyday people, not only because of the discoveries that it enabled, although those ended up being actually far fewer than microscopists of the 17th century had promised, but also because of the incredibly rich tapestry of illustrations that accompanied the publication. So part of that was, this is after the English restoration of the monarchy in the 1660s, and then the creation of the Royal Society. And Hooke was one of the founding members, and so part of the rules, the kind of regulations of the Royal Society was to never make a direct claim about causal mechanisms that couldn't be substantiated through direct observation. And so his idea was, what I perceive through the lens gets directly inscribed. And of course, he has to hire an engraver, an illustrator. And so one of the most famous ones is this huge illustration of a flea from the view through the microscope. And he does other things too, like he'll illustrate the pinpoint of a pen and say that it looks like the surface of the moon. This kind of classical Copernican gesture. This world that we see, this tiny world of small things, is like we could imagine our world suddenly from the point of view of that world. And so the difference then between macrocosm and microcosm becomes suddenly sort of vertiginously relativized. But what ended up happening was the microscopists say, well, if we can kind of drill into those hidden substructures of the world, then we can see how the whole universe functions like clockwork. So this is kind of the mechanistic theory of physics, of philosophy. And as it turns out, the further you keep drilling, all you keep getting are more and more and more surfaces of things, and which don't explain all of the mechanical clockwork.
All right.
And so by the time, fast forward to the 1760s, 1770s, early in Lichtenberg's career, microscope has kind of a bad reputation, at least in the popular sphere. By that point, it's been harnessed to make further discoveries, but the popular interest in it had waned. In terms of his breakthroughs, though, and this gets into the question of visibility that connects to the microscope, he did a number of microscopic experiments, a lot of them involving polyps. And he was interested in those because there was this idea that the polyp is somewhere between a plant and an animal. And it has these very complex and interesting structures. But one of the things that he really excelled at was electricity. And he did all kinds of electrical experiments using a new device called the electrophore. And for those experiments, which were discovered by accident, dust had fallen on the electrophore, which then stimulated the production of static electricity. He discovered they're now called Lichtenberg figures, the diffusion of static electricity, electrical particles that create these like upside down tree branches.
Wow, that's really fascinating. It's great to have you set some of the context that there's a big difference between the 1650s and the 1750s.
Yeah.
So it's 100 years, and so for 100 years, people had time to get used to. I think what you described for us is some sense that there had been over-promising of the kinds of potentials that were going to emerge. So that's interesting. I think about some of the technologies that get innovated today, and you and I were just chatting before the show started about the enthusiasm over the internet and how it's going to democratize everything. And now there's a lot of sense of pessimism and gloom about what's the effect of these internet technologies on our lives. And that's only been since the 1990s, I think, when many people could finally get access to the internet. So imagine what happens over 100 years with the microscope. So I think it's very helpful for you to set that context for us. People had a chance to become somewhat accustomed to the pace of discoveries, and it sounds like you're saying some of it was, oh yeah, they've discovered another surface of something else, and so Lichtenberg is able to take this into a slightly different direction, and he's supplementing some of the optical innovations with other kinds of ways of manipulating things. You just told us somewhat by accident, electricity. So, one of the things that you've written about, and I think you've framed this really well, really captured, is that the microscope is an analogy for a process of knowledge production that can be understood through the power of media and media practice that can actually shift our habits of mind in order to get us to focus on truly small things, both literally and figuratively. Can you tell us what you mean by this and why this is so important for your work?
Absolutely, yeah. So, this connects actually to the question of method and of theory, and it's worth maybe mentioning, since the 1990s, there's been a sort of development in German cultural studies, German literary studies. It's sometimes called German media theory or Germanophone media theory, and it kind of developed out of post-structuralism, inspired by the writings of Foucault and also Marshall McLuhan, that shifts the focus from authorial intent. So what did the author mean by this particular passage? Well, we should look into their life and see what, so it's very biographically focused, to instead thinking about the institutions, the materiality, all of the kinds of things that had usually been thought of as sort of ephemera or, epiphenomenal in relation to the way in which, textual meaning is generated.
Okay.
And so for me, I'm really interested in thinking less so about, what did Lichtenberg mean with this particular passage than how did he write? How did he practice his writing? Okay. And it's really important in this context to mention that all of the reflections and discussions of the microscope are in this massive convolute of texts that he had compiled since his early days as a student at the University of Göttingen. So before he was appointed professor, he was first an undergraduate there. That's about 1765 or so, and he kept writing in them up until his death. So he has about, this is 30 years worth of notebooks with 8,000 individual entries spread across, I believe, 12 different notebooks. And what's interesting to me is then this homology that he begins to, or maybe analogy would be the better word, an analogy that he begins to develop in the course of his notebooks between the view through the microscope and the act of note-taking. And so there, at that point, although some of these notes are actually about microscopic experiments, a lot of them are thinking more about, well, maybe the microscope is something that's capable of producing analogical conclusions, and therefore it's a device for invention. And by that he doesn't mean, that he's going to invent something new by looking through a microscope, but rather that view that through the microscope upon an everyday object that then turns that everyday object into something extraordinary that we wouldn't ever have expected is an analogical, a metaphor that could be then carried over into other branches of thought.
Yes, so can you give us some one or two examples that may or may not be obvious about some of the ways that the microscope was shifting the way people thought about the world and the way not only they were creating knowledge, but the type of knowledge that was getting produced, or the changes in their experience of the world, because now this capacity to have those views and the study of these very small things was becoming more common.
Yeah, absolutely. One of them, and it speaks to both the power of the microscope and its limitations, was this question of how does reproduction work? That was one of the limits of sort of the classical mechanistic theory that motivated the use of the microscope in scientific settings in the 17th century. Was namely, there were these big debates between the epigeneticists on the one hand and the preformationists on the other.
Okay.
And to make a long story short, the epigeneticists, I'll start with the preformationists as the older school, and they thought that reproduction occurred through insemination into the ovum. A tiny version of the human is inside, and they named him the homunculus, right? So then, in a way, it just gets bigger as it grows into a fetus. Whereas epigenetics thought that actually there are these stages of development that occur as the embryo begins to develop. And the question was, well, how do we resolve that debate empirically? Well, we can point the microscope at it. And it turns out that actually, that's not something that can be resolved with the microscope until quite a bit later in history. And so it's really in the late 18th century that kind of explodes as a debate that could be empirically verified. Okay. And so I think one of the interesting things that comes up, going back to the microscope as metaphor, is this whole question of how you can start off, for example, with the seed of an idea. Maybe it's not fully fleshed out yet. And Lichtenberg will sometimes use the word Keim in German for this, like a seed, and say, only though in retrospect, or in conjunction with a series of other observations that you make, just maybe about yourself or about the world around you, or a scientific observation, that idea can grow into something bigger. So kind of drawing on that discourse about reproduction through the, being informed by these debates by microscopists in the 18th century is something that was proved quite pivotal, I think, for his own writing practice and the way that he sort of thought about that writing practice.
Yeah. So this is all such a fascinating display of the power of having a cultural history of something. In this case, a particular kind of innovation that was not just a material instrument, it was also a set of knowledge practices, which is part of what your work is getting at. Are there things that have happened more recently in our world that, by recently, it could be decades ago, but certainly not after the 1700s, that somewhat remind you of some of those shifts or changes that are at the heart of your research of the 18th century?
Yeah, I think there's two crucial ones. So one, my research into Lichtenberg is part of a broader project called Small Forms, Micrologies of German Literature and Science around 1800. And so, this term small form is intentionally vague and very underdetermined, and that's why I like it. Does not mean aphorism, and it does not also mean, a small thing in the actual world. Instead, it kind of yokes all those things together under the aegis of smallness and invites us to think about the parallels and connections between them in exactly the same way that people in the 18th century were drawing those connections between seemingly unlike things.
Okay.
The reason why I bring that up is because, so a small form could be an aphorism, it could be a note, it could be a fragment, but it could also be something microscopic, right? It's a microscopic object. This would fall under the category then of the micrographia or the micrology, the study of small things. And so when I think about, the microscope as an instrument for viewing small things, and also the writing practice of Lichtenberg, which draws on that as an epistemic metaphor for thinking about his writing practice, I think, unavoidably, one contemporary example would be the proliferation of small forms on social media, for example.
Yeah.
Before this, we were just talking about Twitter a little bit. The way in which social media have changed fundamentally the way we consume news, the way we consume media, the way we also are invited to digest small bits of text. also the whole sort of framework of social media, of the scroll as always trying to get to the next thing, these little bits of nuggets of information or questionable information, as the case may be. So I think that's one big, one parallel to today's society, for better or worse, is the emergence of social media as a specific kind of platform for small forms. And then the second is, of course, thinking about the pandemic and the invisible particles that make it possible for COVID to be transmitted. And so I think that question of invisibility, of germ theory, of miasma. Lindsay Marr here at Virginia Tech is one of the people who really brought that onto the radar. This old theory of miasma had fallen into disrepute, and it turns out actually that it's quite significant for understanding, all of the little invisible, in some cases highly contagious, microorganisms and viruses that are floating around in our very rooms and atmospheres.
Yeah, no, that very compelling way of displaying those connections. So how did you arrive at being someone who's studying this work? What was your move into this professional world?
Sure. So with German studies, it's a series of accidents. I first started, when I was in college, I had a sort of very emphatic relationship to Sigmund Freud, and I read every psychoanalytic text I could get my hand on.
Okay.
And from there, it sort of developed into a more general interest into, the interfaces between literature and science. And to me, the 17th and 18th century in the German context seemed like a particularly interesting period, because during that period is right when those two discourses and approaches start to separate. And so it's interesting precisely for that reason. It's this kind of this crucible moment where suddenly, with specialization, you get increasing complexity of their findings. They begin to pull apart. So Lichtenberg is like right at that, like by the time he dies, he's right at that moment.
Okay.
And for small forms specifically, it's a very German topic in a way, and by that I mean, not German studies per se, but actually in Germany. And in the past couple of years, there even have been research groups clustered around this topic. Again, thinking about traditional literary genres like the aphorism, but from the perspective of media studies. So how are these things stored? How are they transmitted? What kinds of writing practices and cultural practices like reading do they presuppose? How do they shape them? All those kinds of things that if you just focus on the history of or the attributes of a particular canonical literary genre, kind of fall by the wayside.
Yeah. And what about your engagement with students? So what are some of the things that you teach, and maybe one or two of the experiences you've encountered with students that it has been revealing for you as an instructor?
Yeah, that's great. I take my teaching here at Virginia Tech really seriously, and pretty much every course that I teach, with the exception of a film studies course, is in German. And we have pretty high-level conversations, actually. I've always been very impressed by the German abilities the speaking abilities of our students.
Okay.
In terms of the kinds of courses I teach, one of the things for me that I always think about is how a course, say about the 18th or 19th century, can be framed around a contemporary issue. So just as one example, I'm currently teaching a course called German Exile Culture in America. And the primary focus of the course is on the various writers, philosophers, political theorists, and everyday people who fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and made the United States their home and influenced United States culture and were in turn influenced by United States culture. But the jumping off point for that course is thinking more about the contemporary situation of refugees around the world, especially as I first started teaching this course, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe in 2015. And how the experience of exile shaped the German Constitution and made it possible for the creation of the specific federal office for integration and refugee migration and integration.
And what would you say have been especially rewarding about the different kinds of work you do? Because there's the research, there's the teaching, you've been doing publishing as well. But what when you think about it all, and do you think is especially top level in terms of fulfillment that you get from this work?
Yeah, well, going back to thinking about students, it's nice when you have students who write to you after they graduate and tell you about how much they enjoyed their courses, and seeing what they do after that, and also being able to interact with them outside the classroom. I'm also currently the faculty representative for the German Culture Club, which organizes a lot of events on campus, and so that's one of the things that I really find fulfilling. But aside from that, I enjoy. This is one of the downsides of the pandemic is, we didn't get to socialize with our colleagues in the field and exchange ideas, but I really appreciate, when you can go to a conference, when you can go to a workshop and be able to socialize with people who work on really quite obscure arcana that happens to overlap with yours. And I think that's something to me where it feels really rewarding, because suddenly that bubble that you used to feel like you're in has been burst, and now you are exposed to all these people who are working on, overlapping or intersecting things.
No, that sense of intellectual community is so vibrant, and I think you captured well the power that it has to be transformative and to propel one's own sense of discovery.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us an opportunity to learn about the fascinating work that you're doing. And we want to thank you, our audience, for joining us for another episode of Vox Humanities. We invite you to explore other episodes on the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities YouTube channel. You can also listen to episodes of the Vox Humanities podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. For information about the Humanities Center, visit the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities website. And for more information about this and other media produced by Virginia Tech Publishing, please visit the publishing website at publishing.vt.edu. Thanks for watching, and we hope you'll enjoy it, and hope that you will join us for a future episode of Vox Humanities Conversations.